go ahead and get rolling. If you've been on these calls before, and I think most of you have, I just want to represent the NIST cybersecurity framework. So NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and they have a cybersecurity framework that is increasingly becoming the de facto guidelines for measuring your security and for building on your security posture. So to high level this for anyone who is new to this call or has not seen this graphic presented before, the NIST cybersecurity framework separates these our security posture into prevention and reaction measures. And on the prevention side, we have identifying is specific to locating the data that we deem to be most sensitive, whether that's a regulatory standard that says this healthcare information is sensitive data, or it's intellectual property data that is deemed to be sensitive. So it's identifying that data and identifying where that data resides. Protection is a pretty standard, well-established security vertical. We've been doing it for years. It's antivirus, it's system hardening, it's firewalls, it's everything you have been doing to keep people out of your network. Detect, as we can see, it's at this pivotal point in the graphic between prevention and reaction, and detection is quickly becoming more popular for organizations to invest in, and this is looking at detecting when your network has been breached and reducing the amount of time a bad actor is in your network once they breach the network. So reducing what is called dwell time is really the goal of detection. And we're seeing this with things like user behavioral analytical engines, and seeing things like security monitoring that might tip us off to somebody being in the network. Respond is focusing on how you respond when somebody is in the network. So changing passwords across different systems. This could include forensics. And it probably includes, it definitely includes using your incident response plan, which I'll talk about a little bit later in today's presentation. And then recovery, again, continuing to leverage that incident response plan, but specific to bringing up your backups and how you get back to normal operations once somebody's been removed from the network. So that is a high level of what this framework looks like. I like to represent that to put everybody in the same frame of mind as we kind of go into some of these security news events. So today's going to be a little bit different. If you've been on this call before, the format's going to be just a little bit different than you might have seen before. I'm going to start with some phishing stories, and then we're going to talk about a breach in Atlanta, which you may have read about. And then we're going to end with some discussion about Facebook, but it's actually going to be more about compliance in the direction that it may be going in light of some recent Facebook news. Okay, so this month in phishing, so if we just covered phishing stories, we could have an hour-long presentation every month that only talked about phishing. So instead, I wanted to focus on a couple of research notes that came out this month. So let's start with the state of Michigan. So they did a security audit. Part of that audit was focused on cybersecurity awareness. 5,000 employees were audited. 25% of those employees clicked the malicious link in that email, and 20% of those employees entered their user ID and password. In total, that is 250 employees in the state of for the state of Michigan that just gave access to the network. That's across a bunch of different departments. Some have access to more sensitive data than others, but clearly that's troubling. I'll talk about lessons learned here in a summary of this slide, but there's an important note about how Michigan handles their security awareness today. Another report that came out this month Microsoft released their annual security intelligence report. So I wish I could have spelled it out on the slide, but I was running out of space there. So the acronym SIR is how we'll refer to it. So Microsoft, by virtue of having a large network of services that lots of people use, uses their security intelligence report to review the security landscape over the past year. So that includes looking at 400 billion emails, 450 billion authentications, and 1.2 billion devices. For the phishing portion, focus on the fact that 53% of email threats are phishing. That's probably not entirely news to most of you. Additionally, 75% of those contain a malicious URL. So again, in the lessons learned, we'll talk about what that means for us. So the last kind of piece of research or reporting that I looked at this week is on business email compromise. And when we talk about business email compromise, we're talking about more than the sending of malicious links. We're talking more about impersonating others once you've breached a system, or spoofing others once you've breached a system. Things beyond what today's technology and even tomorrow's technology is able to pick up. So the statistic's been kept for a little while by a few different organizations, but back in 2016, the FBI reported 3.1 billion in losses as a result of business email compromise. In 2017, that number grew to 5 billion, and now Trend Micro, the security solution company, has estimated over $9 billion in losses as a result of business email compromise. And the main takeaway of this is technology has its limits. So a few lessons that I think each of these reports reinforced here. One is the importance of developing a comprehensive security awareness program. So one note on the state of Michigan audit there, they actually have a security awareness program. However, it's not being enforced with all users. Only a subset of their users are in the security awareness program. But 250 users in your organization giving away their credentials is a huge security concern. Once a user, even if they're, say, lower level, don't have access to as sensitive of data, that one hook into the network is enough to start building and seeking out those other credentials and things like CEO fraud and other dangers. So having a comprehensive security awareness program is important. At Peters and Associates, that looks what we do for both our customers of our security awareness program as well as internally is on-demand training, all new employees, and regularly after that, and monthly phishing tests. So being repetitive, making sure it's being reinforced. If you fail the phishing test, rolling you back into training automatically. So full coverage kind of for security awareness. The other takeaway from both the Microsoft report and the business email compromise, technology solutions are not enough. Your users often looked at as the weakest link in the security chain today. They can also be one of the strongest links if they're well trained and can alert you to possible attempts at breaching the network. And then, of course, regularly audit your environment. That's right in line with doing regular phishing tests and making sure that everybody is on their game when it comes to security. Okay, I just spent half a slide telling you how new tools aren't helpful, so I'm going to contradict that a little bit here. While new tools, or while our employees are extremely important and probably the most important link in phishing, there are some ways that tools can help. So if you're already on a service like Microsoft Office 365, you might have advanced threat protection already. This product's been around for about 2 years, but they recently released an update that I thought it was worth highlighting, even though you've probably heard about this from us before. There's a new phishing update on this. So at the core of the product is something called safe links and safe attachments. In safe links, users that receive links over email, those links are overwritten by Exchange, and they are investigated to see if they go to a dangerous place. The value of having those links overwritten means that if at any point in time that location is redirected to a potentially dangerous IP address, it's being checked every single time by Microsoft. So every single time a user clicks it, it's going to be checked and will be blocked by Microsoft if it is a malicious site. The Anti-Phishing Edition specifically targets spoofing. So everyone's familiar with those types of emails that come in where this looks just like an email that I get every day from Nate, but there's something just not right about the email address, or there's an extra M in it. So I'll show you a screenshot of what that looks like, but it seeks to protect people from others impersonating common email addresses. The other tool I'll highlight is actually developed by us and is relatively new. We're starting to roll this out to some clients, but it's a weekly security audit of Office 365. We're also developing one for Azure at the moment, but currently it's for Office 365, where we're running reports to review suspicious mailbox rules. These have been become of greater interest lately because hackers and attackers will seek to create rules that help to cover their tracks or cover the fact that they're in that mailbox, like automatically deleting some emails or hiding some emails in another folder. So we seek those out, auto-forwarding rules. We've seen instances where entire mailboxes were being forwarded to a Gmail address, which is obviously a huge data breach. So weekly review of those things, as well as some ATP data and administrative audit. So on the ATP piece, this is what that sample looks like. So you can see John Fedor, he's our principal architect. I get a lot of emails from him, and he's sending to me from this testingnew-atp.onmicrosoft.com domain, and ATP alerts me and says, hey, this looks like somebody that you talk to a lot. His email format's exactly like the Peters email domain format, but we don't think it's that person. Obviously, the URL there, or the email domain he's sending from, is very obvious, but if it was from Peters with 2 E's or Peters with an extra S, where it's a little bit tougher to tell, this can help out your end users in that regard. And then these are just some of the headers from our weekly security audit. I don't yet have a scrubbed sample report that I can show that won't detail information that we don't want to share that's more specific to our environment, but this is an example of what that some of the sections of that. Okay, so some of you may have read about a cybersecurity incident with the city of Atlanta. They were hit with something that's called SamSam ransomware. This first came out around in 2016, but at the start of this year, security researchers started seeing a kind of a reappearance of this. Specifically, it exploits some Java vulnerabilities, but the most kind of dangerous part of this software is that it can delete backups. And that started as Veeam backups, but and I don't yet know if we've seen an instance in the wild where it goes after another backup system, but we can assume that they will be seeking out other backup systems as well. So this is a particularly dangerous piece of ransomware because it one of our core recovery mechanisms is falling back on our backups, and if they've gone and deleted those backups, we obviously can't fall back to them. So they're asking, I believe it's $51,000 from the city of Atlanta. How'd the breach occur? So there's a little bit of speculation here because the city of Atlanta has been a little bit less than transparent in with the public about how the breach happened, and even some of the details about it being ransomware in the first place is partially speculative because it was leaked to the press, but no public statements from the city itself. So from what we understand currently, the belief is that this was a result of some poor port hygiene, some ports that shouldn't have been open, that allowed the attackers to scan portions of the environment to identify any servers that still had this Java vulnerability. So obviously another piece of that is unpatched vulnerabilities that that the city should have had patched. There are some interesting notes in here too, in that the city is in the midst of a migration to some cloud services, and so the breadth of the attack was actually reduced as a result of some of those services living in cloud environments that are a little bit more up to date in regards to patching. And so I guess to some degree that speaks to the strength of the cloud, at least as it relates to patching and keeping up to date. So that's what we know about the breach so far. I also wanted to look at kind of a timeline of where we're at. So this started around 5 a.m. on March 22nd. That's last Thursday. We are now at March 26th with no resolutions. By March 23rd, the affected systems, most of the affected systems were shut down. This extends to Atlanta's airport, which is the busiest in the world. Or at least the busiest in the U.S. But so obviously this is crippling to the city to not be able to have their services operating, and being down for, at this point, 5 days for any business that's generally considered unacceptable. And so we can see some of the ramifications here for the city of Atlanta. So there's a lot of lessons learned from this one. First of all, basic security hardening. It doesn't seem like the city was up to date in that regard. Certainly patches were behind, but also just network security, having open ports that shouldn't have been open. There are some reports that the attack was initiated over RDP, things that should be locked down, particularly outside the network. So basic security hardening does not appear to have been done, or at the very least been kept up to date. Regular vulnerability scans. So understanding what your vulnerabilities are. We prefer to scan on at least a quarterly basis, though we understand that there are costs that come with running a scan on that kind of frequency. At the very least, doing a vulnerability scan on an annual basis to see where you might be at risk. We add new servers a lot, we add new network equipment, things change in regards to public exploits and things like that. Scanning the network and understanding where you're vulnerable could have helped to at least reduce the impact of this. Patching, we again stay up to date on your patches. Most of the major breaches that we see are the result of patches being behind. I think the Department of Homeland Security estimated around 75% of these breaches are a result of patches being behind. So if we look at something like WannaCry, which hit last year, that patch had been available, I believe it was about 3 months prior to the attack that took down a large portion of the UK's healthcare system. So patching and putting a program in place is important. So we do monthly patching on ourselves as well as on our managed patching customers. So that's important for organizations to stay on top of. Next is offline backups. So obviously with the rise of ransomware like SamSam, there's one other that just came into the news recently. I believe it's called Zenus, that also seeks out and deletes backups. So that's kind of repositioning the importance of having at least some offline backups in the event that you're hit by something like this. And then lastly, have an incident response plan. So the city of Atlanta is clearly stumbling here, not having many public declarations since this hit, haven't indicated whether they'll pay the ransom or not, but their systems, as of yesterday at least, were still down. So have an incident response plan in place. An incident response plan doesn't just involve the IT department. It involves understanding the systems that the organization uses, understanding what should be a priority for being recovered and coming back up in the event of a breach, or in the event of any disaster. And then lastly, if you're an organization that operates with the public, and I know not all of our customers are, but understanding what your responsibilities are in regards to alerting people. And again, if you have to interact with the public, you probably need some measure of PR level response. So all of those go into what an incident response plan looks like. Okay, so lastly is Facebook, and you've probably heard about this story. I don't want to go too deep into all of the different vectors of the Facebook issues right now, but obviously the main concern is Facebook and its privacy problem. So user data being provided to companies, specifically is Cambridge Analytica. There was an app developed by a Cambridge professor that allowed users to opt in to provide some information, but it also was able to grab information of their friends who didn't have their profile set to private. In total, it ended up being quite a bit of personal data about these individuals. That data was then provided to Cambridge Analytica, which was a violation of the terms of service. Facebook ordered Cambridge Analytica to delete that data, and not all of it was deleted. So I know it's kind of a tangled web. It's also a tangled web of what is allowed and not allowed with the service, but in summary, there's really no enforcement of that data being protected once it's out of Facebook's control. There was no accountability on that end. And then the Android application privacy issue goes a bit deeper in that the Facebook application was collecting call, text, contact data from users that had downloaded the application. So again, what is Facebook doing with all of that data, and who are they sharing it with? One other thing that's come up recently in light of Uber, the breach of Uber and the breach of Equifax, is these reasonable notification rules. So again, this one might lean toward a little bit more towards consumer-facing organizations, but they're important in Illinois, at least, if you're familiar with PIPA, which just went into effect on January 1st of last year, that has requirements around reasonable protection for security of personal information, and that extends to not just consumer-facing organizations. Other business-to-business organizations can hold that data as well. So reasonable notification rules are being fought against both Uber and Equifax for the time in which it took users to learn of the breach and learn that they need to go and protect themselves. So both of these stories go to what we might be facing soon, and I think this slide is a lot more future-looking, so this is not something that I think you need to go tackle right away, but what kinds of new compliance standards are we going to see from this? Obviously, GDPR, the EU's new data protection and data privacy regulations go into effect in May, and there's a lot to GDPR, but the core tenet is that EU citizens' data must be identified, and they have a right. This kind of goes back to a safe harbor term, but the right to be forgotten in regards to how that data is handled, and when I leave your service, deleting the data on me, and who you're sharing the data with, and what level of transparency you have. Facebook's major issues over the past months, years, might be pressing towards standards that mirror GDPR, or other organizations going to have to deal with this if this is implemented in the U.S. And then lastly, states are leading the way. So states, especially on the reasonable notification rules, several states have implemented laws around this. Colorado, I believe, just did a 30-day notification of breach rule, and Oregon, I believe, did 45 days for notification of a data breach. So we're seeing states where the federal government has not moved fast enough to implement new standards of how their citizens' data is kept, stored, and transferred and shared. We're seeing states step in to start introducing new laws, and it's something that all of us need to be aware of and understand how it's going to impact how we take care of the data that we have. And that is all I have. Sorry, we're running just a bit over, but our next webinar is going to be this month in cybersecurity again, the April edition. So if you'd like to sign up for that, peters.com/events. Please register and attend. And then, of course, our blogs are being updated 3 times a week. We have a new blog out there. Our latest security blogs are some, actually a little bit about that ATP component that I talked about, as well as some updates on the Meraki product line, and review from our Winter Security Summit if you weren't able to attend. So I'm sorry, we are a little bit over, but if you've got a question, feel free to stick on the line and either take yourself off mute or use the IM window, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.